So look, we'll get underway. Obviously, this is a briefing session for the open call that was released last week for the Upper Herbert, Upper and East Burdekin and Bowen, Broken and Bogie water quality programs. I'll just run you through really what we're looking for. So very, very briefly, I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that these programs fit underneath the Reef Trust Partnership, which of course is an agreement between the Australian Government and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. Under that, there's around $200 million that's been allocated for water quality improvement over a 6-year period running up to 30 June 2024. And the objective for that investment, the water quality investment, is to contribute towards targets and outcomes under the Reef 2050 plan and the Reef 2050 water quality improvement plan. So our investments have very much been guided by those plans. The breakdown of that $201 million includes about $141 million for what we refer to as regionally focused on-ground actions, so where we've identified particular regions and particular funding amounts, and the funding that we're talking about today falls within that category. There's around $20 million that's already been invested through an early round of investment. In addition, there are other work streams, including $20 million that's been set aside for traditional owner-led water quality improvement activities. And this is part of a whole of partnership commitment that the Foundation's made, that 10% of the total Reef Trust Partnership would be invested in traditional owner-led activities. There's $10 million that's been allocated for innovation and system change, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that we've run an open call related to that program. We've made some announcements around successful and unsuccessful applicants for some of the streams, and we're expecting to make announcements in the next couple of weeks on the balance of the program. And finally, there's $10 million that's allocated for conservation and protection activities, and that part of the funding has been parked for the time being, and will be kick off sometime next year. But the bulk of the funding's under that regionally focused on-ground actions work stream, $141 million, and we've identified a number of catchments where that will be invested, and in those catchments, quantums of funding and what the particular targets that we have there in terms of the pollutants, and included with that are specific pollutant reduction targets that we've set for those catchments. And these primarily are all either high or very high priority catchments under the water quality improvement plan. The basis for selecting these, there's a report that Alluvium prepared, which is available on the GBRF website, and there are links to it in the RFP guidelines that you will have all downloaded, and it provides the technical underpinnings to how the decisions were made on where funding would be allocated, and also on how the particular targets, load reduction targets for each catchment were set. So obviously we're talking about the three of the programs that are shown here, the Lower Herbert, the Upper and East Burdekin, and the Bowen, Broken and Bogie. For these programs, the three we're talking about today, there is a different procurement process and different delivery model from the previous programs that we've commenced under the regional on-ground work stream. So there is, in this instance, there's no program manager or partnership coordinator being sought or to be appointed. For those of you unaware of the processes we run previously, in the Mackay-Whitsunday and in the Fitzroy, in the Lower Burdekin and other regions, We've run separate processes to appoint regional program managers and regional partnership coordinators. However, in the current case, for these programs, we are not doing that, and that really is a consequence of the size of the budget. The amount that we're investing in the Upper Herbert and the Upper and East Burdekin is relatively small compared with those other programs. We're only talking about $3.5 to $4 million here in investment, and hence we've decided it doesn't warrant the cost of appointing a program manager or partnership coordinator to organise the program and to coordinate between activities. Instead, the process here is simply calling for full proposals from the outset for each of these separate regions, and so we'll use those as a basis for moving straight to a contracting process. That's of course not to say we won't look to coordinate between projects. In the event we have multiple projects operating within one region, then obviously we will be looking to align those as best we can. We'll work with the proponents of those projects to try and get them working with each other. But obviously we expect that will be a more straightforward task given the size of the budget and the likely number of activities that we'll be funding in these programs. The Bowen Broken Bogie is a different case from the Upper Herbert and the Upper and East Burdekin. So the Bowen Broken Bogie, we have allocated quite a large amount of funding, around $27 million has been notionally allocated for investment in that catchment. We had initially thought to defer the investment in the Bowen Broken Bogie until there was a decision made on the long-term future of the MIP, the Dry Tropics MIP, which is currently active there. Because of some delays with the state budget and other factors, we've decided that as an interim measure that we are going to release some of the funding. So in this case, $5 million of the funding that will be invested in the Bowen Broken Bogie. So the process for that is as for the Upper Herbert and the Upper and East Burdekin. So it is just a call for proposals. So we're looking just to fund one or more projects directly to undertake work in that region. We recognise that there is obviously major work ongoing already there as part of the Landholders Driving Change program, and the intention is, to the extent possible, that we would look to align whatever projects we fund with those ongoing activities and the existing mechanisms in place. But no decisions have been made on how that will happen or exactly what that will look like. We will wait until we've selected the activities, we see what projects we're looking to fund and who it is that will be undertaking that work, and then we'll look to have some conversations with the MIP around, if and how those activities might be better aligned. In terms of the longer term future for the GBRF investment in the region, again, that really is a matter of waiting and seeing so that we all understand better what future investment there might be from the state government into the MIP model itself, and then of course into on-ground activities, and we'll, I guess, deal with that issue when we get there. As I say, 3 separate regions. We have 3 different budget amounts allocated. All of the programs are focused on fine sediment primarily. We have target end-of-catchment load reductions. So these are reductions in the long-term modelled sediment loads, fine sediment loads at the end of these catchments, as per the source catchment modelling. The target that we have there for the Bowen Broken Bogie, the 332 kilotonnes, that relates to the full investment that's been allocated to the region, $27.3 million. And so for the $5 million, obviously it would just be a proportionate amount that we're looking for. The programs are all intended to run to 30 June 2024, and projects similarly to run for that period, so around 4 years. We expect if there are any projects that are looking to run in excess of 2 years, then we will have some major milestone points and review points, probably around the 2-year mark. And you will see in the request for proposal template that we ask you to identify some of those milestones and certainly prepare for that. And and that there will be an option for GBRF to terminate contracts at that point, subject to performance. A minimum project size of $500,000. There is no maximum project size. We are open to receiving proposals that would capture the full amount of funding for a region. So you are able to submit a single project for that amount. You're also able to submit multiple projects, multiple proposals for the one region. So you're able to do that. If you wish to submit proposals across multiple regions, then you're able to do that, but you would need to submit separate proposals for each region. If you feel that there would be efficiencies and benefits were you to be successful in being awarded proposals across different regions, then please identify those in your proposals. The proposals need to be standalone, but you could identify particular cost savings that then could be factored in the event that you were successful across multiple projects. The other matter I'd just note in your proposals regarding budget is that it is useful to understand from our perspective the scalability of projects and both up and down, and what that means to the cost effectiveness of the project. So if you're putting in a proposal for $1 million, for us to understand whether a 20% reduction results in a 20% reduction in water quality outcomes, or whether it's some other value, to understand what, I guess, the fixed costs are and what are the ones that simply vary with the project size, and then, as I say, what the relationship between the investment and the water quality outcome would be expected to be. So that will assist us in assessing and then in, I guess, deciding on the ultimate quantum that we allocate, because it becomes a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, potentially pulling together a number of projects. A few other items to touch on. In terms of technical design and review, there's a small portion of the funding that's available, that's been sort of allocated across each of these programs, that's going to be used to fund a technical panel and a technical advisory group. So there've been open calls. Some of you will have seen those, and we're in the process of assessing those now. The intention is that we'll have a small technical advisory group that advises across the whole of partnership on water quality matters, including setting standards and guidelines and so on, and then through the panel we'll have a larger number of pre-approved experts, and the intention is that we'll draw on those for particular tasks, particular inputs into programs, particularly some of these regional programs. And for example, where there are projects that involve major gully or stream bank restoration works, then we'll be requiring proponents to prepare a technical design report for each major campaign of works. So that may be one or a series of major gullies, and we'll be looking to have that design report independently reviewed by someone on our technical panel. Now, it may be that different projects take different approaches towards these sorts of things, and you may look to build into your proposals some form of independent review. You may have an independent consultant who you use to do that sort of assessment. So we are still open to considering that and to have that be used as an alternative. What we would ask is, if you are going to do that, is that you clearly articulate that in your proposal, you identify who it is that will be doing your work, and you identify the cost associated with that. That allows us to compare apples to apples when we compare across proposals. It also allows us, if need be, to carve off that component of the project if we decide that it would be more appropriate to have an independent expert doing that sort of review work. In terms of land management, GBRF is of the view that where there are projects that involve landscape remediation, such as large gully restorations, streambank restorations, that our preference is that that work is also complemented by landholder extension and education activities. So working with landholders on, for example, grazing land management and improvement. That sort of work doesn't need to necessarily be broad scale, but certainly we would view favourably proposals that incorporate an element of landholder extension and education as part of the program. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, you should have seen and should have received, as part of the pack on tenders.net, a water quality program and M&E guidelines. These weren't available when the pack was first posted, but because the guidelines hadn't been finalised, but I think they were posted on tenders.net earlier this week, and I expect anyone who had already downloaded the information pack would have received an email, an update to advise that they're available. If you haven't got them or can't find them, please do let us know. The guidelines build on the M&E plan, the Reef Trust Partnership M&E plan, which you may have been familiar with, and it spells out not only the detail around the indicators, it picks up on the indicators that are in the M&E plan, but provides a little more detail around them and our expectations and how they'll be used. It also describes the data management processes, the types of systems we're going to be using, and so on. And the guidelines are provided at this point to, I guess, give you as much clarity as we can as to what your obligations are, so that you can understand those in preparing your proposals and indeed in costing your proposals. The important point to note on that is that the guidelines are set up identifying what we refer to as our mandatory minimum M&E requirements. So those are the indicators. There's a suite of indicators shown in the guideline, and marked for those are which ones we expect would apply to different projects, because obviously there are different indicators apply to a gully restoration project, to a cane practice change project, and so on. So the guidelines identify which of the indicators we would expect to apply to a particular project. And so those are the mandatory minimum requirements. They primarily relate to the paddock to reef reporting, and that includes, in the case of streambanks and gullies, they link through to the streambanks and gully toolbox, so an expectation that those things are used. We understand and of course support additional and more extensive monitoring and evaluation activities, and so again, in the case of large-scale gully or streambank work, that might be more detailed local water quality monitoring and the sort of the technical support around that to better understand what the actual water quality improvements you're seeing from the restoration activities are. What we're asking in terms of proposals is that you clearly distinguish between those mandatory minimum requirements, who's going to be implementing them, what you're going to be doing and what it's going to cost, and any additional M&E activities. again, who will be doing it, what should be doing it, and what that will cost. And the reason for that is that, and this particularly applies in this space related to fine sediment, is that we will be doing an assessment at a whole of partnership level and then at a regional level on what an appropriate level of investment is into that more detailed monitoring and evaluation work. That is over and above what's necessary just to report into paddock to reef. And so we want to have clear visibility on who's proposing what and what that might cost. In some instances, it may be that we elect to fund somebody directly, an independent expert organisation, to come in and undertake that sort of M&E work separately. But in any case, at this point in the process, so in the proposal phase, we just want to see what you're proposing and what that breakdown is. In terms of engagement with traditional owners, GBRF has a requirement that all projects that we fund will be required to identify the traditional owners of the land where they work and to inform them of the project. We certainly encourage you to look for opportunities to engage traditional owners in projects, but that is not mandatory. There is further guidance being developed on processes and procedures for engaging with traditional owners. In terms of reef credits, I'll just note that where GBRF funds a project, it would be our expectation that any reef credits generated as a result of that project would be held by GBRF as the funder. So we would caution you in preparing your projects about assuming that there will be additional revenue that might be generated from reef credits. If you are intending to register projects for reef credits and you have a pathway that you can see that could and have other donors who are interested in co-investing in the proposal that you're putting forward, then we are open to having some discussions about how that may work. But please note our starting point is that any reef credits generated through GBRF funding would be held by GBRF. You'll see in the guidelines activities that are ineligible. I won't dwell on those. I think they're relatively straightforward. You'll also note that there is, under ineligible activities, that we are excluded from funding any activity that specifically enables an agricultural or other business to comply with their obligations under the reef protection regulations made by the Queensland Government. That's a requirement that's imposed on us by the federal government as a term of the Reef Trust Partnership. You'll see some text there about what our understanding of that is. We understand it's not intended to exclude activities that are specifically designed to allow a landholder to comply with their requirement. Sorry, it is only intended to exclude activities specifically designed to allow a landholder to comply with their requirements under the regulations. We also understand it's not intended to exclude activities which may incidentally result in compliance with the regs, or activities that are intended to support or encourage landholders to achieve land management practices that materially exceed minimum requirements. If you have any concerns, please let us know and we will look at individual projects on a case-by-case basis if there are any grey areas. In terms of what can be funded, those of you that have reviewed the alluvium report will see that it identifies what it has set out as being the most cost-effective interventions in different catchments. And so alluvium will tell you that I think in the Upper Herbert, that it's stream bank restoration and grazing practice change are the most cost-effective measures. I want to stress, because we've had many questions on this and there's been a great deal of confusion in many quarters, that the list is not restrictive. So simply because alluvium has identified particular intervention types in its report, that does not limit what we will fund. Our primary considerations are around feasibility and cost effectiveness of the intervention. So we are open to any measures provided you can demonstrate that they will work and that they will be cost effective compared with other options. We'd also note that incentives are eligible for funding, so landholder incentives, but we will be looking for a clear link between any expenditure and water quality outcomes. There are 3 criteria which will probably be familiar to many of you, for any of you who've submitted for other programs at least to us. The first is around cost effectiveness of the project, and that is around the cost relative to what the program can be, or the project can be expected to achieve in terms of the total long-term average reduction in the pollutant at the end of the basin. So again, this is the modelled outcome at the end of the basin. So two points to stress here. One is that in terms of the load reduction, that's where we want to look at the end of the basin. We refer in the guidelines again to the alluvium solution statements. They are a useful benchmark to use in terms of understanding delivery ratios and efficacy of particular intervention types. You're obviously welcome to present your own figures if you have justification, evidence to support them, but alluvium provides, certainly the benchmark that we will start with in terms of saying, if I restore, X meters of stream bank or Y meters, cubic meters or area, of gully in this particular catchment, what do we expect that will translate to at the end of the catchment? So the alluvium numbers are a useful benchmark for that efficacy of interventions. What I would stress is that they are not necessarily the best starting point for you in terms of the cost, because the cost that you use in your cost effectiveness need to relate to your own costs, your project costs. We'd encourage you to not simply rely on the generic costs put forward by alluvium in terms of assuming that's what it will cost you to achieve particular outcomes. You should look at what your own cost base will be in implementing the project to understand what area of restoration or hectares of practice change or whatnot it might be, and then bring those two values together to come up with your cost effectiveness. The second criteria relates to the applicant's ability to implement the project. It's relatively straightforward. I think we're really looking for the usual around experience and expertise of the applicant, as well as familiarity with paddock to reef reporting as a preference, and also demonstration of the local networks and relationships necessary for the project. The third criteria relates to the proven effectiveness of the proposed approach. And again, and forgive me for labouring the point here, but having seen quite a number of proposals over the last few months, and many people, I think, misunderstand what this criteria is about as well. What we want here is to see evidence that what you are proposing to do works. That is what we mean by the proven effectiveness of the proposed approach. This is not a question of your ability to implement it. That is tested through assessment criteria number 2. This is about whether this approach, if done properly, will actually achieve water quality outcomes. And again, I'd stress it's not about demonstrating that you have implemented this approach. It's about demonstrating that this approach, when implemented, has in fact achieved water quality outcomes and the nature of those outcomes. Finally, key dates. The grants are out there, obviously. Our information session today. Grants closed on the 12th of June. We would hope to have made announcements, advise people of the outcome of those within 4 weeks from them closing. In terms of probity issues, obviously we are keen to ensure that all applicants have a fair and equitable access to information, and as such, all questions should come through the grants at Barrier Reef email. So please send questions through there. Any questions from this session, any further questions that are emailed in will be collated and responses will be posted on GBRF website. All questions are de-identified. Also, just to stress, if you do intend applying for a grant and you haven't yet, please register at tenders.net so you can get any updates as they come through. That's all of our presentation. So just now going to start looking at the Q&As, and I'll respond to those as I can get my head around them. So the first question is the project specification call for siltation management. Can the program control of nutrients and metals? The short answer is yes, they can be included in them, but primarily the program needs to be about dealing with fine sediment. So if there are additional benefits, because a project will also be capturing nutrients, then obviously we will consider that, and there are benefits associated with that, so that would improve the attractiveness of a project. Likewise, if there is incidental capture of heavy metals, then yes, please do identify that. But primarily, we are aiming to address fine sediment. That's the pollutant that's been identified as a priority under the Water Quality Improvement Plan for these regions, and under the Scientific Consensus Statement as being the greater threat to the reef, and so that's where our investment will go. So I would not, so a proposal that is primarily about dealing with nutrients or metals and which has some incidental impact on fine sediment is very unlikely to be funded. The cost effectiveness that we will look at will be about the cost effectiveness of the measure in dealing with fine sediment, and then in considering the overall value for money, we might look at any additional ancillary benefits that come from the proposal. Can equipment used specifically for rehabilitation of severely degraded land be purchased using project funds, such as a chisel plough for contour ripping and seeding? Yes, I think I might take that question on notice, and we might come back. I'll just check. We do have some restrictions in the eligibility around equipment, I know, but I think I think there are options to do that, provided, but ultimately the real test will be around the cost effectiveness of the measure as a whole. Question 2 is, can funds be used to purchase pasture seed as part of land rehabilitation? Yes, absolutely. Will smaller projects be considered for local land care groups that would struggle to implement and manage a $400,000 project? No, unfortunately, just because of the nature of the management arrangements around the project. We're looking for projects that are in excess of that $500,000 mark. What is the specific particle size definition of fine sediment? I will pull that out and we will post that answer, because I think I know, but I will save myself the embarrassment of getting it wrong. And so we will post that online. Next question, would you mind clarifying if we need to submit separate proposals for each project location within the same catchment? No, you don't. No, you don't. So within one catchment can be one project that has one proposal that has multiple locations, multiple elements to it. So that's completely fine. If you wanted to, you could submit 2 separate proposals within one catchment, but equally it can come as one proposal. I guess if there are multiple dimensions to a proposal, then as I mentioned earlier, it is useful for us to have visibility of the different components. so that if we look and want to say, yes, we want to fund some of this but not all of it, to understand exactly what that might mean in terms of the team, the approach, the cost and the cost effectiveness. I have a comment here. I assume land care groups could form part of a bigger project which would enable them to deliver their projects. That's correct. There's absolutely nothing that would stop a land care group from linking up with other deliverers, and certainly we've seen that in a number of the other programs that we are funding. There are land care groups that are linked in as part of those major projects. And I guess I'd stress that that's our preferred delivery model for how those sorts of activities are undertaken. Again, I know there is disappointment around the size of the program, but from a management perspective and the overhead involved in running a large number of small projects, it's not the most cost-effective way to deliver these programs and to deliver the sorts of outcomes that are required of us. Next question. For the sediment savings targets, are they tonnes per year or at the end of 4 years of funding? So the targets are a long-term average annual reduction. So the way the source catchment modelling works is it assumes particular activities being undertaken in the landscape, and based on that, over a long, over the time series that it will run, the 30 or 40 years in the time series, that model then generates and says, on average, this is how many tonnes come out every year at the end of this catchment. Our objective is to change that number based on the number of tonnes in our targets, 330 tonnes in the case of the Triple B. So it's not a cumulative amount. It's about saying, if we've implemented this measure, on average, this is how much it will reduce every year on an ongoing basis. Here's the next question, which I think is the same question effectively. Are the target load reductions of the program an annualised rate of the target load reductions over the 4-year program? Yeah, so it's the same question. Do you want to achieve a sediment reduction of 44 tonnes per year in the Upper Burdekin or 11 tonnes per year? So the figures, I can bring the figures back up. So yes, so in the Upper and East Burdekin, the 44 kilotonnes, that the target is that by the end of the program, every year, starting from the end of the program, although recognising that it does take time for some of these measures to have their full impact, but by the end of the program, each year there will be 44 kilotonnes less per year reaching the end of the program, each end of the catchment. I have a question. Considering that native pasture seed is non-procurable in commercial quantities and at a reasonable price, can exotic species be used for land rehab projects? We don't have anything that excludes this explicitly. Obviously, any activities would need to comply with any legislation, any biosecurity legislation around how what species were used, but there's nothing in our program or our guidelines that say that we will only fund natives. Obviously, we're interested in understanding that there are, what the impacts of particular approaches towards seeding might be, whether that's full grass pasture or whether that's for trees, and also to understand what it means for the sustainability of the project. But we don't have any automatic no's on these, on what can and can't be funded there. The next question. In the Upper Burdekin, that suggests a target abatement cost of $96 a tonne per year. The Triple B is an abatement cost of $85 a tonne per year. These appear to be extremely optimistic based on the experience of Reef Trust and other programs. Is that correct? The values, I think they sound about right, of what we are targeting. So that, and the values are based, I mean, they certainly draw on a lot of the work that has been done under Reef Trust. Alluvium accessed all the data that was available to it from all the projects that it could get its hands on. So they're the figures that we've worked with. But ultimately, I guess we will find out through this process and the proposals that come forward what people think that they can deliver. And if it's not possible for projects to deliver at that rate, then obviously we'll be taking whatever proposals we can work with that will be the more cost-effective ones. I think what level of detail is required regarding health and safety documentation? Is it at an organisational policy level or down into site-specific risk assessment detail? I might throw over to Anna. Are you able to answer that around what we need at this point in the process? I can't recall.
Hi, I think that at this stage, it is just around the organization policy level, although when we do the due diligence of the shortlisted proposals, we may ask for site-specific risk assessment details.
Thanks, Anna.
No worries.
This is a question, have we selected members of the technical advisory panel or is this still ongoing? Yes, this is still ongoing, sadly. It has been closed for a while now, but we have had other priorities and so no, the panel has not yet been appointed, but we hope that will happen in the near future, certainly within the next 2 weeks is the intention. I haven't got any more questions here at the moment. We'll just pause for another minute or two. Will the targets for streambank reduction be based on Reef Trust Gully and Streambank Toolbox? I'm not sure what you mean exactly by will the targets for the reduction be based on that. So, the targets that we've set at the program level are the ones that that I think probably are still showing up on the screen there and that are in the guidelines. So they're the overall targets. Individual proposals will be coming forward with their own proposals and I guess targets for that. So if we're investing $1 million in a particular project and targeting X number of tonnes, then that will be the target. From an M&E perspective, yes, in the first instance we will be requiring all projects to report through the Gully and Streambank Toolbox, and so that will be the basis initially, or one of the indicators that we'll be using, one of the mechanisms we'll be using for assessing what the actual sediment reduction will be. As I mentioned earlier, there is also an intention to look across the broader portfolio of projects and consider what level of investment we make in more detailed water quality monitoring to understand the actual sediment reduction that have been achieved by particular sites. That's likely to result in us funding, some gold standard monitoring sites across some selective some projects, some sites, or some sites within some projects, and then perhaps a lesser level of monitoring in other sites. As I say, the intention is to try and do that broadly across, or to consider the whole portfolio of projects that we're funding and strike a right balance in terms of the amount that we're funding and where we're putting that, and hence the request for detail in your proposals around what level of monitoring you're going to be doing and costs associated with that. With respect to the detailed proposals, does the entire project team need to be specified, including the earthworks contractors that would be utilised? No, I don't think so. I don't think we need that level of detail. I mean, to the extent that you have earthworks contractors that you know and have better costs, better certainty around costs, then obviously that's great. But no, I think that's something that we're comfortable to leave to a next stage. Given current COVID restrictions and the possible need to visit sites, the detailed proposal development will some scope be available for qualifications in proposals by the panel? Yes, that's no problem. We obviously understand the challenges around COVID and travel and so on, and so to the extent that limits what you can do in terms of preparing proposals now, then yes, please just identify what those qualifications might be and how that's limited your proposal preparation and then what you might need to do at a later stage. We have asked, I think, in the application form, advice on any impacts around COVID might mean for how you operate. We recognise that that's a very difficult question to answer because there's just so much uncertainty around what the long-term picture might look like. But obviously there are different types of activities, some of which are easier to implement while restrictions are ongoing, whereas there are other types of projects or approaches which are just completely impossible. So to understand, I guess, where, what sort of restrictions would limit you or wouldn't limit you will be useful, and then we can factor that in.
Robert, there was one more question that came through the chat. It says, are the traditional owner-led projects linked to the current call?
No, they're not. No, they're not. So there will be separate processes that are run to look for traditional owner-led projects. There is new governance structure which has just recently been, I guess, implemented under GBRF with a number of technical advisory groups, including a water quality technical advisory group, so a traditional owner water quality technical advisory group, and so those groups are in the process of determining how they are going to look to release funds. I guess what I would say is that for the current proposals, if there are clear potential linkages, then yes, to projects that you're going to be putting forward, then please do identify them, and then that may be a trigger for us to not to consider those those opportunities under this grant round, but it may open the door to other discussions. So yes, please do flag them in your proposals where you see those opportunities. Ideally in consultation with the relevant traditional owner groups and with their fully informed consent to their inclusion. Okay, that's just keep coming. In terms of extension work, do we need to go to the level of detail of listing potential educators / workshop presenters? Ideally, in the section including personnel who will be working on the project. Yes, ideally we would want to see that. I mean, if, as with any aspect of proposal, if you don't know and you can't put it forward, then that's then so be it. But if that's an important part of the program that's being delivered, then part of what we'll be assessing is the capacity of the team that you're presenting to do that, and whether they're people that are of the, you know, sufficiently qualified, of the right calibre to do that. And so if there's a blank there around who's going to do it, then that obviously won't be favourable to a proposal. We would want this sort of work, this sort of extension work to be done by appropriately qualified and experienced people. So we would like to see detail of that in the proposal if at all possible. Will woody weed control projects to improve pasture cover be funded under the program? I think that would, I'll come back to my earlier point, which is that there's nothing that's really excluded. What you would need to do would be to be able to present evidence that say that by removing this woody weed cover, this is what the change in water quality will be. So you would need to have evidence to show what the local impact would be in terms of the runoff from the site. And by that I mean quantified, not simply anecdotal evidence that say that pasture is better than woody weed. We would need something that quantifies to say this is how, by clearing X hectares of woody reed and returning it to improved pasture, that this would be expected to result in this particular outcome in terms of water quality improvement. I'm not sufficiently familiar with all of the elements in paddock to reef and the risk water quality risk framework to know whether that's captured there in any way. It may be that data exists and is straightforward to pull out, but I'm not sure. But sorry, on the woody weed control project, I'm happy to take that on notice, and well, at least, sorry, not so much to take it on notice, but to follow up if there's any further information that we can identify around existing knowledge on how those changes contribute towards water quality improvement. But otherwise, it would be for the applicant to identify that sort of information. So again, I'm at the end of the questions for the time being. I'll give it another minute or two. If you have asked a question and it hasn't been answered because somehow we missed it, then just please type it up again and it'll sort of come to the top of the list. There's no more questions. I'll just give one more minute just in case someone's in the middle of typing something. But okay, look, no more questions. So I think we'll call it to a close with that. If you do have any further questions, then obviously just email them through to the grants email, and we'll respond to them as soon as we can. Again, a reminder that we'll post. There'll be this recording and the slide will be posted up on the website, and all the questions and answers that we've just run through will also be posted up on the website, including if we identify any additional information on the woody weed question, we'll post that in response to this question. And similarly, the earlier question, which was around purchasing equipment, I'll just ask you to follow up on the website again in a few days' time, probably early next week, when we have the answers up there, and we'll have a more considered response on that particular question. Sorry, I have someone who has raised a hand. I have to find what that. More question, Suzanne, if you've got a question. So we had a raised hand, but no follow-up comments. So I'll just, maybe it was someone scratching. Very good. Well, look, we'll leave it at that. So thanks again for tuning in today and for your interest in the program. Look forward to seeing your proposals in due course. Thanks again all.